It was a quiet Saturday night in Moscow, Idaho, November 12, 2022. Across this small college town, students were laughing, celebrating, and enjoying the kind of ordinary weekend that felt completely unremarkable. Restaurants stayed open late, music drifted from off-campus houses. The University of Idaho community felt safe, familiar, and alive with the energy of young people simply living their lives. No one could have imagined what the next few hours would bring. Before sunrise on November 13, 2022, law enforcement officers would respond to a residence on King Road. Inside, they would discover 4 University of Idaho students, all young, all full of promise, all gone. The victims showed signs of fatal stab wounds. There were no signs of forced entry. And in those first devastating hours, there were almost no immediate answers. A peaceful college town would never feel quite the same again. What followed those early morning hours transformed a quiet college town into the center of one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in modern American history. Moscow, Idaho, a place most Americans had never heard of, suddenly appeared on front pages and television screens nationwide. Law enforcement agencies worked methodically, but publicly they said very little. For weeks, investigators stayed largely silent, while the rest of the world turned to the internet, searching desperately for answers. Online communities dissected every available detail, and speculation spread faster than verified information ever could. Then, after nearly 7 weeks of mounting public pressure and relentless investigative work, authorities announced an arrest. The suspect was not a local neighbor or someone already known to the victims. He was Bryan Kohberger, a criminology doctoral student studying human behavior and criminal justice, just miles away at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Nestled in the rolling hills of northern Idaho, Moscow is the kind of place most people would describe as quiet, welcoming, and safe. With a population of around 25,000, it built its identity around the University of Idaho, a campus that drew students from across the country each fall. Neighborhoods surrounding the university filled with shared rental homes, late-night study sessions, and the ordinary rhythms of college life. Violent crime here was not just rare, it was almost unheard of. Residents left doors unlocked, students walked home after midnight without hesitation, and the community carried a deep sense of trust. Off-campus streets like King Road were lined with modest houses where students lived together, hosted gatherings, and built friendships that felt like family. Nobody paid much attention to those addresses, but after the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, one address on King Road would become permanently etched into the national memory. Before we explore the investigation itself, this documentary pauses to honor the 4 young people whose lives were taken that night. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old, remembered by those who knew her as fiercely loyal, adventurous, and deeply devoted to her closest friends. Madison Mogen was also 21, described as warm, funny, and someone who made every room feel more alive. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old, known for her ambition, her energy, and her genuine care for the people around her. Chapin was 20 years old, remembered as kind, athletic, and full of potential. All 4 were active members of the University of Idaho community, each building toward futures that would never come. Their deaths sent shockwaves far beyond Moscow, reaching communities across the entire United States. Families, classmates, and strangers grieved together, and the investigation that followed carried the weight of their memory every single step of the way. On the morning of November 13, 2022, everything changed on King Road. Law enforcement received a report involving an unconscious person at the residence. When officers arrived, what they found was far beyond what that initial call had suggested. Inside the home, 4 young people had been fatally stabbed. The scene was immediately secured, and investigators began the careful, methodical work that major cases demand. Evidence technicians moved through every room, photographing details that would later become critical to the case. Forensic specialists collected biological evidence, fingerprints, and other materials with precision. The residence remained secured for several days as the full weight of what had occurred became clear to authorities. What began as a response to a single report quickly expanded into one of the largest criminal investigations in the entire history of Idaho, drawing resources and attention from across the country almost immediately. In the days that followed, investigators moved quickly and methodically. Law enforcement from Moscow Police Department, Idaho State Police, and federal agencies including the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined forces, creating one of the most coordinated investigative efforts the state had ever seen. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood, knocking on doors and conducting formal witness interviews. Surveillance footage from nearby homes, businesses, and street cameras was collected and carefully reviewed. Thousands of digital files were catalogued and analyzed by dedicated teams working around the clock. Hundreds of tips poured in from the public, each one logged and evaluated. Authorities made repeated public appeals asking anyone with information to come forward. But as the investigation intensified behind closed doors, something else was happening simultaneously. Across social media platforms, speculation exploded. Theories spread faster than facts, and online communities began drawing their own conclusions. Authorities responded firmly, urging the public to avoid rumors and allow the investigation to proceed without interference. One of the first major public breakthroughs came when investigators announced they were searching for a white Hyundai Elantra believed to have been near the King Road residence during the early morning hours of the killings. That single announcement changed everything. Nationwide attention intensified almost immediately, and the investigative team was flooded with thousands of tips from across the country. Across the region, law enforcement reviewed thousands of vehicles matching that description, cross-referencing registrations, surveillance footage, and witness accounts in an effort to narrow the field. It was an enormous undertaking that required significant coordination between multiple agencies. At the time, no suspect had been publicly named or identified. Families were waiting, communities were anxious, the public wanted answers. But behind the scenes, away from the headlines and the speculation spreading rapidly across social media, the investigation was quietly and steadily developing, moving closer to a conclusion that would soon shock the entire nation. With the white Hyundai Elantra now a central focus, the investigation entered a more targeted phase. According to court documents released following the arrest, investigators assembled a detailed picture using multiple streams of evidence. Surveillance video, cellular phone records, witness interviews, and forensic materials collected at the King Road residence were all brought together by the investigative team. Surveillance footage captured a white Hyundai Elantra traveling through the surrounding area multiple times during the early morning hours of November 13, 2022. This repeated presence drew significant attention from analysts working the case. Investigators carefully compared vehicle characteristics visible across multiple surveillance cameras positioned throughout the neighborhood and nearby streets. Through this methodical process of cross-referencing footage, registration records, and additional investigative steps, the search gradually narrowed. That narrowing eventually focused directly on a vehicle registered to Bryan Kohberger, a criminology doctoral student at Washington State University, located just miles from Moscow. As investigators processed the crime scene, forensic specialists carefully examined every item recovered from inside the King Road residence. Among the most significant discoveries, according to the probable cause affidavit filed with the court, was a knife sheath found near one of the victims. This single item would become a critical piece of the investigative puzzle. Investigators stated that biological material recovered from the sheath was submitted for deoxyribonucleic acid analysis. Court documents allege that the results of this forensic comparison became one of several factors collectively supporting probable cause for the eventual arrest. The sheath itself pointed toward a specific type of fixed blade knife, and the deoxyribonucleic acid profile recovered from it was compared against a known reference sample. However, the narrator carefully notes that, like all evidence presented before any trial, this forensic material remained fully subject to legal scrutiny, defense challenges, and the court's ultimate determination of its admissibility and weight. On December 30th, 2022, law enforcement officers moved swiftly and arrested Bryan Kohberger at his family's home in Pennsylvania. The arrest came after weeks of carefully coordinated investigation involving local, state, and federal authorities working in close collaboration. News of the arrest spread almost instantly, with television networks interrupting regular programming and newspapers placing the story prominently on their front pages. The public, which had followed every development for nearly 7 weeks, reacted with a mixture of relief and lingering questions. Kohberger was a criminology doctoral student, someone who had studied the very systems now pursuing him. As the story dominated national coverage, it was important to pause and acknowledge a foundational principle of the American legal system. In the United States, every criminal defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. That principle remained absolutely central as the case moved forward into its next chapter. Following the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, legal proceedings quickly attracted national and international attention. Court hearings addressed a wide range of matters, including evidence disclosure, deoxyribonucleic acid testing, digital records, media coverage restrictions, and the scheduling of future proceedings. Prosecutors outlined the evidence they intended to present, while defense attorneys challenged various aspects of the investigation, questioning how certain evidence was gathered and interpreted. These hearings were not simply procedural formalities. They represented the adversarial nature of the American legal system at work, a system designed so that both the prosecution and the defense present their strongest arguments before an impartial court. Judges evaluate evidence according to established legal standards, ensuring that constitutional protections remain in place throughout the process. Every motion filed, every hearing held, and every ruling issued reflected a system built on the principle that the truth must be tested before justice can be determined. For more than 2 years, the King Road murders dominated headlines across the country and around the world. Books were written, documentaries produced, and millions of people followed every court filing, every hearing, and every legal motion. The case had become one of the most discussed criminal proceedings in recent American history. Then, in July 2025, everything shifted in a way few had anticipated. Instead of proceeding to a lengthy jury trial, Bryan Kohberger chose to plead guilty. On July 2, 2025, he appeared in court and entered guilty pleas to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary, in exchange for prosecutors agreeing to remove the death penalty from consideration. Kohberger accepted 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. There would be no jury selected, no weeks of testimony, and no verdict read aloud. A courtroom appearance that lasted far less time than the investigation itself brought the trial phase to a close. The guilty plea did not bring universal relief. It divided victims' families and observers in deeply meaningful ways. Some believed the plea was the right outcome, sparing families from years of exhausting appeals and the emotional weight of reliving painful courtroom testimony. For them, closure came with finality. But others felt something essential was taken away. They wanted every detail examined, every piece of evidence placed before a jury, and most importantly, they wanted to understand why. Why these 4 students? Why that night? Why at all? a full trial would likely have included weeks of testimony from law enforcement investigators, forensic experts, and witnesses who were present in the surrounding area. Cross-examinations, evidence presentations, and expert analysis would have filled the courtroom for months. Instead, the guilty plea meant that much of that evidence would never be examined in open court, leaving questions that may never receive satisfying answers. On July 23, 2025, the courtroom became something far more than a legal proceeding. It became a place of remembrance, grief, and reckoning. Family members and surviving roommates stepped forward one by one to deliver emotional victim impact statements describing the lasting trauma the murders had left behind. Some spoke through tears, some with barely contained anger, and others quietly reflected on the futures their loved ones never got to live. They described empty chairs at family dinners, milestones that would never be celebrated, and wounds that no sentence could fully heal. When Bryan Kohberger was given the opportunity to address the court directly, he declined, offering no words, no explanation, and no acknowledgement to the families sitting just feet away. The judge then delivered the sentence: 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional sentence for the burglary charge. Bryan Kohberger will spend the remainder of his life in prison. Although the criminal case reached a legal conclusion, significant